Welcome to the CEC Report. It's September 21st. I'm Robert Barwick, and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, did ASIO orchestrate the Muslim protests to whip Australians up for war? 9/11 Mark II is the countdown to World War. And finally, blame Ross Garnaut for lower living standards. So first, did ASIO orchestrate the Muslim protests? As we're recording this, Craig, we've just been notified actually that there is a chain of text messages being sent around Australia by white pride groups trying to whip up something for this weekend as a counter protest to the Muslim protests in Sydney last weekend.
I hope this is not the second phase of this, Robbie, because I know the number of responsible Muslim groups, which is most of the Muslim population, have basically said do not go out and protest this week. Last weekend's protests were basically hijacked by a very small element, which is the way these groups work. What I'm concerned about is this is going to be phase two, where you have the sanctioned, you might say, opposition, run by intelligence agencies, literally provoking against these other radical Islamic groups some sort of violence, which is then mass reported.
Well, let's talk about this question of intelligence agencies. We've got a lot of experience in being paying close attention to protests over the years, and we know that there are certain easy ways to manipulate these things, and that's what we see happening here. The protest in Sydney last week was pretty ugly. There's no denying that. The group that did it, Hizb ut-Tahrir, is banned in most nations. Some of those nations, including Russia, have warned Australia that they should be banned here. The question is, why aren't they? We, the CEC, led the fight against the anti-terrorism laws that Howard passed in 2003, which included powers to ban organisations. Now, we don't believe proper terrorist groups shouldn't be banned. We just opposed those laws because they were so broad and could ban anyone. But the government's got powers to do this, and they haven't done it. Even though in 2007, the New South Wales state government of Morrissey Emma, whose own electorate was Lakemba, which is the main Muslim area in Sydney, Emma called for this group to be banned, Craig. But Philip Ruddock refused on advice from ASIO. Why? Well, one obvious reason is this. ASIO and the intelligence agency in Australia coordinate very closely with Great Britain. And Britain historically has harboured most of the world's terrorist groups. Therefore, they are happy to have this group, the Australian ASIO organisation is happy to have this group operating in Australia, and that should shock most Australians who were shocked by those images. You know, when you saw those images, bear in mind of little kids, saying behead people, etc. That group has been cleared by ASIO, so that's a big question. Why? I want to raise another thing ASIO did. Just days before the protest, people might remember the news reported an ASIO raid on an alleged terrorist group in Melbourne. They didn't find anything, really. Whatever they found was scant. What struck me was how well publicised this was. Because if ASIO didn't want it to be publicised, it wouldn't have been. The other aspect of it is it was made public that an ASIO agent had infiltrated this group. Publicising that information is also quite unusual, and my reading of it was quite provocative. So you do have a large Muslim population in Australia, but a tiny minority on the fringe that are this radical. Was this raid timed to stir their feelings up in order to guarantee the kind of scenes that we saw? So we're questioning this, Craig, because the protests in Sydney were part of this worldwide wave of protests, ostensibly over a YouTube video insulting Islam. However, we're asking these questions because the events in in Libya, which were the key ones that started it, we have proved that they themselves were far from spontaneous, right?
This is a big issue, Robbie, which we'll have to cover a fair bit today, because most people aren't aware of the driving force behind this. Now, maybe people are listening as we're speaking saying, well, why would you have ASIO whip up these riots? Why would they do this? This is insane. Well, we're in a context now where the global financial and monetary system, as we've talked about on this show, is in the process of disintegration. This has been known for a long time, And when you have a process of economic disintegration, the population isn't going to be very happy about that, and consequently is going to react.
How do you maintain control?
Well, that's why you had the first 9/11. Now, we've been very explicit on our website, on the LaRouche website, about the fact that 9/11 was an inside job. The problem we have today is that we're now into 9/11 take 2. What we're witnessing is the same confluence of operations as we saw with 9/11, particularly with the murder of the ambassador in Egypt. Now,
In Libya.
In Libya. Now, when the 9/11 took place, right, immediately after that, well, actually, Mr. LaRouche said on radio as it was happening that this was actually an inside job. There was no possibility that this could just be a handful of terrorists coordinating this level of operation.
And he predicted it would be blamed on Osama bin Laden.
Exactly. Now, the purpose of is what you've seen come after this. In America, you see a rash of fascist laws like the Patriot Act, the Homeland Security Act, all these sorts of things. Why? To control the domestic population. Here in Australia, by 2002, Howard had put on the table something like 28 separate pieces of legislation. Now, we campaigned as an organisation vigorously against this because these were fascist laws, they were unnecessary, and they were, as we saw, and as we're seeing today, they're going to be directed towards the domestic population. So, you know, on the 12th of June 2002, we publicised in the Australian a full-page ad, the draconian anti-terrorist laws, end them, don't amend them. So we put that ad out, and we had something like 500 people, I think it was, I can't quite remember, actually sign on to that.
And I should point out, it says the draconian anti-terrorist laws because the Australian wouldn't let us use the word fascist.
That's correct. We also ran an entire federal election in 2004 on this subject. The Citizens Electoral Council stopped the draconian police state laws, again, because we wouldn't use fascist. But we actually ran an entire campaign on this and detailed in our own publication the nature of the battle. And then we followed that up with, in June of 2004, after the Australian, we followed this up, went up in the Age, Stop the Police State Anti-Terrorism Bill 2004, because there was a series of these bills brought up. So we, very vocal, very upfront, and quite explicit that this operation was not in the interests of Australians. Now, if you look ahead further to 2007, there was a major scandal break in the world press, and that was the fact that the British government, actually the British Crown, it goes all the way to the Crown, was caught in what's called the Al Yamama scandal. And this was a deal that created a $200 billion slush fund, ostensibly in a arms for deal swap, where the British government would supply fighting weapons to Saudi Arabia. Now, what people don't realise is that Saudi Arabia and Britain are basically in you might say, lockstep in terms of funding international terrorism. And that's a bit of a shock to people, because people think it's Iran that's doing this, or Syria is sponsoring terrorism. No, that's the cover story. The issue is that it is Londonistan, as we call it, or Saudi Arabia.
London harbours most of the world's terrorist groups. Saudi Arabia funds them. And most of the world's active terrorist groups that we hear are named are all Sunni, right? Iran is a Shia country. The head of the Sunni Muslim tradition is Saudi Arabia, and they're funding these right around the world. They're the ones in Libya now, they're the ones in Syria, etc.
Robbie, it was out of the 17 of the 19 hijackers for 9/11, 17 of them were Saudi Arabian.
Which is why we attacked Iraq.
Well, how does that work?
Saddam obviously was behind it if 17 was Saudi Arabia.
Well, look, there's also another breaking development this last week, particularly on the events of September the 11th, was that the former Senator Bob Graham, who's now retired, came out with a new book, which is called Intelligence Matters, the CIA, the FBI, Saudi Arabia, and the Failure of America's War on Terror. Now, he chaired the Joint Congressional Commission on US Intelligence Failure surrounding 9/11, has been absolutely scathing on Bush and Obama for not releasing the 28 pages of documentation that actually shows that Saudi Arabia, through the monarchy, they've funded directly the terrorist operation on 9/11.
This was covered up from Bush on, but the real scandal, Obama has kept the cover-up going.
Because he said he was going to release them on the behalf of the people of that suffered on 9/11, but he again kept it under wraps. So, people can get a copy of our 2007 New Citizen and read for themselves what the scandal represented, but it proves that, again, Saudi Arabia is the actual country that harbours terrorism and supports terrorism. So when you look at the events of September the 11th now in Libya with the assassination or murder, I should say, of the America's ambassador, what you're seeing there is a systemic cover-up taking place after the fact, but it was really a consequence of America's own foreign policy crimes in Libya. And continuation, look, instead of using US Marines to protect the embassy, what did they have? They had a private British firm, called Blue Mountain, which was linked to the SAS and British intelligence. It was supposed to supply security for the Libyan embassy, right? And the point I want to come back to is that, look, these terrorist networks that attack the Libyan embassy are actually supported directly by the Saudi Arabians and London.
And America had advance notice of this, right? We've put this out in a press release today. They had advance notice of this, and the fact that they did proves that it has nothing to do with the reaction to the video insulting Muhammad.
That's the point. Is the shock factor of this taking place is the same type of shock factor, not maybe as great as the original 9/11, but it brings back the memories.
Yep.
Right. Oh, look, people, it's incredible when you look at the evidence. I mean, Kim Singupta, I think his name is, from the London Independent, who's a defence correspondent, said a couple of days later, on September the 14th, he said, and I quote, "According to senior diplomatic sources, the US State Department had credible information 48 hours before mobs charged the consulate in Benghazi and the embassy in Cairo that American missions may be targeted, but no warnings were given for diplomats to go on high alert and lockdown, under which movement is severely restricted." That's from the London Independent, right? Then you have the president himself from Libya, and the president himself said publicly on the CBS Face the Nation on September the 16th, he said, "The way that these perpetrators acted and moved, and they're choosing the specific date for this so-called demonstration, I think leaves us with no doubt that this was predetermined." And he says, after being quizzed by the interviewer, Shifa, who said, "And you believe that this was the work of Al-Qaeda and you believe that it was led by foreigners, is that what you're telling us?" He said, "It was planned, definitely. It was planned by foreigners, by people who entered the country a few months ago, and they were planning this criminal act since their arrival." So there was a number of different agencies that were already warning the US government about this. But the official line is, from Susan Rice, who's covering this up on behalf of Obama, "Our current best assessment, based on information that we have at present, is that, in fact, when this began, as it was a spontaneous, not a premeditated response to what had transpired in Cairo. I've been to Libya and I've walked the streets in Benghazi myself. The US is extremely popular in Libya."
What a joke.
I mean, what a joke.
We'll have to take a break now. We're going to resume this after the break, and we're going to talk about how this 9/11 Mark II is the countdown to World War. Welcome back to the CEC Report. 9/11 Mark II is the countdown for war. Now, Craig, before the break, we were talking about how this attack on the American embassy in Libya and the subsequent protests is the next 9/11. It was done on 9/11. It's having the same impact as the original 9/11. And by that I mean, people remember how 9/11 was fraudulently used as the excuse to go ahead with a pre-existing agenda for regime change in Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with it. The British and Obama have a pre-existing agenda for regime change in Iran and Syria, which they know will send the world to war with Russia and China, but they're determined to go ahead with it. And this 9/11 Mark II has created, and all the protests around the so-called video, has created a convenient smokescreen for that. Now, in terms of that, what we appear to be in a really, the last few seconds of the countdown to an attack on Iran. We know that Obama has given Netanyahu of Israel the go-ahead, but he's given him the go-ahead to publicly he's saying he's opposed to it. Privately, Netanyahu knows that if he attacks, Obama will support, especially in election year. The Telegraph in London of September 15 had a dramatic report that there's an armada of British and American Navy ships massing in the Persian Gulf. They intend to stop Iran from blocking the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation to an Israeli strike, because of course that would wreak havoc with the world's oil supplies. Another telling indicator is that a British minister, the Armed Forces Minister of the Cameron government, has been fired by David Cameron, and he said he was fired for opposing a preemptive strike on Iran. And the way the newspaper report said, former Armed Forces Minister Sir Nick Harvey claimed he was sacked to avoid a damaging coalition split over a preemptive strike on Iran. The Liberal Democratic former minister told friends he was fired in the recent cabinet reshuffle to allow Liberal Democratic Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg to sign Britain up to an Israeli-US preventive strike to take out Iran's nuclear installations. Friends of Sir Nick, who was handed a knighthood just days later, say that he could have embarrassed the Lib Dem leader by being too critical of Israel's actions if he had still been in the key Ministry of Defence post. Now, Craig, the Russians say Iran isn't a threat. The impartial members of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that is the actual weapons inspectors, not the political hacks at the top, the weapons inspectors say Iran isn't a threat, and they were the same weapons inspectors who said Iraq wasn't a threat and were proved right there. So this is exactly the same type of bogus thing, and that's where, in order to pull it off, they need this 9/11 Mark II, don't they?
Well, the only way we can stop this, Robbie, is to get rid of Obama. Obama, as Mr. LaRouche in the United States, physical economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche has said, if you get rid of Obama, you immediately get rid of the threat. Obama has been the cover for what's been taking place for the last several years, right? If he continues to be in that position, then we do risk nuclear war with, unfortunately, China and Russia involved.
And covers the word, because can I say, if it was Bush still there doing exactly the same thing Obama's doing, there would be hundreds of thousands of people on the street in every country around the world protesting. But because it's Obama, and even the actor John Cusack has you look him up on the internet, he's done an interview about how Obama is getting away with murder because he's Obama, even though from a standpoint of human rights or civil liberties or anything you like to choose, he is being just as bad as George Bush.
He's killing hundreds of people, if not thousands, using drones. He's killing American citizens with drones. He is killing people with his healthcare policy. The evidence is mounting up more and more.
And he's killing heads of state.
He's killing heads of state indirectly through these omissions that we've talked about, or directly, deliberate omissions. The point is that Obama has blood on his hands, and until the American people or whoever throw him out, we can't stop a march towards some form of war.
Exactly, because Netanyahu is, he's mad as a cut snake.
He's a puppet of the British.
Nothing would
be
been. Exactly, but people like him can't get away with what they want to get away with if America does its job properly.
That's right.
Right. People got to look at who really controls the strategic balance here, and that's it's quite dangerous right now.
Get rid of Obama, you get rid of the problem initially.
The other thing, Craig, is if it does go ahead, and this is why we raised the issue of the ASIO orchestration here, like with every other war that's happened this century so far, Australia would be drawn right into it.
Well, we're already in it, Robbie, because we're already supporting the sanctions against Iran. We're part of the British Commonwealth. We're part of the official policy. You said yourself, ASIO is directly, tied hand to hand to British intelligence. We're in this thing whether we like it or not.
Which is why this is such an important issue for Australia right now. Okay, when we come back, we're going to change the subject. We're going to talk about Ross Garnaut. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, blame Ross Garnaut for lower living standards. Now, why do I say that? This week there's been a major conference in Sydney on Australia and China's century, and economist Ross Garnaut gave a speech, Craig, where he said Australia would suffer falling living standards as the mining boom wound down. And he was predicting that that's going to happen. That's inevitable. We're in for a sharp drop in living standards. Quote, I think we're going to have a very difficult time adapting to the decline in living standards that's going to be a necessary part of the adjustment to the end of phase 1 and 2 of the boom. Now, this is hilarious because he caused it.
Well, isn't it funny? You've got an economic hitman
Yep.
like Ross Garnaut forecast exactly what we've been telling people for 15 years, ever since, in fact, LaRouche's 9th forecast of 1994, that the entire global financial monetary system is going to disintegrate. Now, Robbie, just back in June, we published our last New Citizen, where we had what was called the slow nuclear death,
Yep.
right, which went through all the economic parameters that showed that our physical economy, that which we produce, the manufactures, was literally disintegrating. So it's a little bit like to Ross Garnaut,
Well,
I mean, this is what they have promoted. This is exactly what is supposed to happen.
Well, exactly. Can I put it this way? We forecast this would happen as a consequence of certain policies. He's the man who implemented those policies.
Oh,
So in 1989, he wrote the Australia in Northeast Asian Ascendancy Report, which was the free trade report from which the government began slashing tariffs and destroying our manufacturing. You want a good standard of living? Manufacture for yourself. He's the guy who destroyed our manufacturing. And then Australians might remember him more recently as the man who was the climate change guru who wrote the blueprint that became the basis for the ETS and now the carbon tax, and is using green fascism to destroy what's left of our physical economy. So his forecast it's the classic self-fulfilling prophecy, wouldn't you say?
People shouldn't make the mistake that somehow he's incompetent. He's extremely competent at pushing policies that are designed to destroy physical economies. This is classic free trade doctrine of the old British Empire under the guise these days of globalisation, privatisation, the whole works, where you literally reduce or take away the means of supporting physical production for a nation. That's what free trade does. It says, okay, where can you produce something the cheapest? Therefore, we'll shift our production to that cheap place with no regard for the fact that you destroy your local manufacturers. That's the doctrine of free trade. It was the doctrine of the British East India Company, 200 years ago, where you had mono economies, economies that were designed to do one thing.
Yep.
Here in Australia, Ross Garnaut supports, obviously, the Keating idea that we shouldn't be nothing more than a giant quarry.
Well, to back that up, he's the man who designed Papua New Guinea's economy for when it went independent in 1975 and made Papua New Guinea's economy even more dependent on raw materials than Australia's is. Right? So he followed exactly the same model.
So this is not incompetence. This is completely intentional. It's following the policy line. That's why he gets promoted to all these these positions, because he's an expert economic hitman in this sort of policy.
Yep.
So we're not going to see, when people start to see their standard of living decline, as it's already happening. This is not something that's new. Just ask any young family today how many jobs they have to survive in their mortgage, right? Or the people who have been thrown out of work because their manufacturing jobs have been shipped offshore. This is nothing new. All he is now doing is what I would call ass covering, basically saying you can expect this to happen because, in effect, I caused it.
Well, let's hold him accountable. We have to leave it there, Craig. That's it for this week's CEC report. We've covered very important material at the beginning, though. We've put out a press release on that today, so look up our website for our press release. And next week, we're going to be producing a flyer on a more in-depth on 9/11 Mark II. So thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more.